I always loved the holiday season. There was something magical about the crisp winter air, the smell of pine, and the soft twinkle of lights that made everything feel warmer, brighter, even on the coldest nights. Ever since I was a kid, decking the house with lights was my favorite tradition. It wasn't just about the decorations. It was about creating something beautiful that brought joy to everyone who passed by. And when I bought my own house, I knew I'd go all out every year. Because why not? Life was too short to dim your light. But apparently, the Homeowners Association disagreed. It started with a letter. A crisp white envelope slipped into my mailbox, stamped with the HOA's seal. A reminder that, despite owning my home, I was still under their watchful eye. At first, I thought it was just another one of their generic announcements, but when I opened it, the bold letters at the top made my stomach twist. Violation notice. Unauthorized holiday decorations. I laughed at first. It had to be a joke. I mean, wasn't the whole point of the holidays to celebrate and spread cheer? My lights weren't even that excessive, just a tasteful display with a few strands of twinkling white lights along the roofline, a glowing reindeer on the lawn, and a candy cane-lined walkway. Nothing wild. Certainly nothing that deserved an official warning. I tossed the letter on the kitchen counter, thinking it was a mistake. Maybe some Grinch on the board had too much time on their hands. But a week later, another letter arrived, this one more aggressive. Final notice. Failure to comply will result in fines of $100 per day. That wiped the smile off my face. I reread the letter 3 times, my blood boiling with each pass. Was this seriously happening? All I wanted to do was spread a little joy, and now I was being fined for it. I decided to call the HOA office and sort things out. The phone rang twice before a curt voice answered. Homeowners Association, this is Pamela speaking. Pamela. Of course. She was the HOA president, the same woman who once sent me a warning because my grass was a 1/4 inch too high. She had a reputation for being a control freak who treated the neighborhood like her personal kingdom. Hi, Pamela. This is Alex from 1427 Maple Drive. I received a notice about my holiday lights, and I just wanted to clear things up. Is there some mistake? My lights aren't excessive. There was a pause before she answered, her tone as frosty as the December air. There's no mistake, Mr. Parker. Your decorations violate Section 5.3 of the HOA bylaws. No exterior modifications without prior approval. Modifications? I nearly laughed. They're holiday lights. People put them up every year. She sighed like I was a child who didn't understand basic rules. Rules are rules. If you don't remove them by Friday, you'll be fined. I suggest you comply. And with that, she hung up. I stood there, gripping the phone, my heart pounding with frustration. This wasn't about rules. It was about control. Pamela loved wielding power, and I wasn't about to let her win. That night, I stood outside my house, staring at the warm glow of the lights. Neighbors walked by, smiling and pointing at the display. Kids laughed as they admired the candy canes lining my driveway. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just about my house. It was about the whole neighborhood. People loved the lights. It made them happy. And if Pamela wanted a battle, I was more than ready to give her one. I wasn't going to take down my lights. In fact, I had a much bigger plan in mind. The next morning, I woke up with a plan brewing in my mind, a plan that would make Pamela regret ever sending those ridiculous violation notices. If the HOA wanted to play hardball, I was ready to play along. But I wasn't going to stop at just keeping my lights up. I was going to take things to a whole new level. I grabbed a fresh cup of coffee and sat at my kitchen table, scrolling through my phone. Within minutes, I had a list of every neighbor who had ever complained about the HOA's absurd rules. I already knew a few families who had faced fines for equally petty reasons, things like leaving their trash cans out an hour too long, or having a mailbox that didn't meet aesthetic guidelines. Pamela had turned what was supposed to be a community into her personal dictatorship, and I knew I wasn't the only one tired of it. I started by texting a few neighbors. My first message went to Mrs. Henderson across the street. She was in her 70s and had lived here longer than most of us. Last Christmas, she got fined for putting up a wreath on her front door without official approval. I figured if anyone would be on board, it was her. Her response came back in seconds. "Count me in. I still haven't forgiven them for that wreath nonsense." Within an hour, I had a small army. Families up and down the street were eager to fight back against Pamela and the HOA. Everyone was tired of the constant rules, and my plan gave them the perfect outlet to push back. That afternoon, I headed to the nearest home improvement store and filled my cart with every type of holiday light imaginable. Multicolored strands, giant inflatables, LED projectors. If it lit up, I bought it. When the cashier gave me a curious look, I just smiled and said, "Big plans." By the time I got home, the sun was starting to set, but the real work was just beginning. My driveway became a staging area as neighbors came by to pick up decorations and share their own. The energy was contagious. People who barely spoke to each other before were now laughing and working together like old friends. As the night grew darker, the neighborhood began to transform. Every house on my street lit up brighter than ever before. It wasn't just a few lights. This was a full-blown holiday spectacle. Lights draped over every roof, inflatable Santas and reindeer on every lawn, and one neighbor even rigged up a snow machine. But the centerpiece, my house, I turned it into a glowing beacon. Thousands of lights twinkled from every inch of the roof and walls. I set up synchronized music so the lights flashed along with classic holiday tunes. On my front lawn stood a massive 12-foot inflatable Santa holding a sign that read, "Merry Christmas, Pamela." By the time we finished, the entire street was glowing so brightly you could probably see it from space. And best of all, every decoration was perfectly within city code. The HOA had no legal grounds to touch us. The next morning, I woke to the sound of furious knocking on my door. I didn't even need to check. I already knew who it was. Sure enough, when I opened the door, there stood Pamela. Her lips pursed so tightly they looked like they might disappear. "Mr. Parker," she snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "What do you think you're doing?" I smiled, sipping my coffee. "Celebrating the holidays, of course. Isn't it festive?" Her face turned an impressive shade of red. "You're violating the HOA's guidelines. Again." I shook my head slowly. "Actually, no. I reviewed the bylaws carefully. There's nothing that says we can't decorate as long as we follow city regulations. And, well," I gestured at the street, "the whole neighborhood seems to be in the holiday spirit." She sputtered, struggling to come up with a response. This is outrageous. I'll call an emergency meeting." "Feel free," I said cheerfully. "Oh, and by the way, happy holidays, Pamela." She stormed off, but I knew she wouldn't go down without a fight. If she wanted a battle, though, she'd picked the wrong person to mess with. Over the next few days, our street became the talk of the town. Cars slowed down to admire the dazzling display, and families from nearby neighborhoods drove through just to see the lights. Someone even posted a video of our synchronized light show on social media. It went viral overnight, racking up thousands of views. Kids laughed and played on the sidewalks. posing for pictures with the massive inflatable Santa. Neighbors who barely spoke to each other before were coming together to share hot cocoa and stories. For the first time in a long while, it felt like a real community, not just a place controlled by Pamela's endless rules. But as expected, Pamela didn't take the defeat quietly. 2 days after our light show launched, I got a letter taped to my front door. Bold red letters stamped across the top read, "Final warning, immediate removal required." I laughed out loud. It was almost impressive how fast she moved. But this time, I wasn't backing down. Later that afternoon, as I adjusted the lights on my roof, I spotted Pamela patrolling the street. She wore her usual sharp-shouldered blazer and held a clipboard like it was a weapon. With every step, she scanned the decorations with the same expression one might reserve for a crime scene. I climbed down from my ladder just as she marched up my driveway. "Mr. Parker," she began, her voice clipped and official, "you've received a formal warning. These," she waved a hand at the blinking lights around her, "are a direct violation of our aesthetic standards." I folded my arms, meeting her glare with a smile. "Actually, Pamela, I checked. The city's holiday decoration ordinance allows displays between November and January. My lights are well within the allowed brightness level. There's nothing you can do." She opened her mouth to argue, but I held up a printed copy of the city's regulations. "I highlighted the relevant sections for you. Feel free to double-check." Her face twisted in frustration as she snatched the paper from my hand. "You think you're clever, don't you?" "Not particularly," I said, grinning wider. "I just like celebrating the holidays." She spun on her heel and stomped away, but I knew this wasn't over. If there was one thing I'd learned about Pamela, it was that she couldn't stand being outsmarted. And if she couldn't beat me with the HOA's rules, she'd find another way to retaliate. Sure enough, that evening, a patrol car rolled slowly down the street. I watched from my living room window as the officer stopped in front of my house, shaking his head at the lights dancing across the lawn. When he finally rang the doorbell, I was ready. "Good evening, officer," I said, stepping outside. "Beautiful night, isn't it?" He gave me a tired smile. "It is. But I'm here because someone filed a complaint about your light display." I didn't have to guess who. "Let me guess. Excessive brightness?" He chuckled. "Something like that. Look, I had to check, but I already confirmed with city records. You're fine. Honestly, your lights are a lot nicer than some of the stuff I've seen." I laughed. "Appreciate that, officer." Before he left, I couldn't resist asking, by any chance, was the complainant a woman with a sharp voice and a permanent scowl? He laughed outright at that. "I didn't say it. You did." As he drove away, I leaned against my porch railing, watching Pamela's curtains twitch. She'd lost again, and she knew it. But I wasn't done yet. If she wanted a fight, I was ready to turn things up a notch. That night I made a few phone calls. By morning, I had something big in motion. Something even Pamela couldn't shut down. The next morning, I woke up to find my inbox flooded with messages. Apparently, the video of our light show had caught the attention of the local news. A reporter wanted to interview me about the Holiday Light Rebellion, as they called it. The headline alone made me laugh. By noon, a news van was parked outside my house. Neighbors gathered as the reporter, a cheerful woman named Kelly, set up her camera crew. Pamela, of course, was lurking at the edge of her driveway, her face pale with outrage. "So, Mr. Parker," Kelly began, holding the microphone toward me, "it seems your light display has become a local sensation. What inspired this festive extravaganza?" I glanced at Pamela's house before answering. Honestly, it started with a simple love for the holidays. But when the HOA tried to shut it down, I realized this was about more than just lights. It was about community. People should be able to celebrate joy without unnecessary restrictions. A ripple of applause spread through the crowd. I could feel Pamela's glare burning into the back of my head, but I kept my expression calm and friendly. Kelly smiled, clearly enjoying the drama. "And what do you think about the HOA's stance that your lights violate community standards?" I shrugged. "I checked the city regulations. I'm in full compliance. Besides, if bringing people together is against the rules, maybe the rules need to change." A few neighbors cheered, and one woman called out, "We love the lights." The interview wrapped up shortly after that, but the effect was immediate. By evening, the news segment aired, and within hours, more people drove by to see our display. Even the mayor's office shared the video on social media, praising the community spirit. Pamela, however, was not amused. The next day, she called an emergency HOA meeting. Flyers were taped to every door, demanding mandatory attendance to address the holiday light violation crisis. It was so absurd that I laughed out loud. I arrived at the meeting early, taking a seat near the back of the community hall. The room buzzed with quiet excitement. People were tired of Pamela's rules, and my light show seemed to give them the courage to speak up. Pamela stood at the front, tapping her pen against the podium with barely concealed irritation. "This meeting is called to address the flagrant disregard for HOA guidelines," she announced sharply. "Certain residents have chosen to violate our aesthetic standards, disrupting the peace and dignity of our neighborhood." I raised my hand. "By certain residents, you mean me, right?" Her eyes narrowed. "If the shoe fits." I stood up, facing the crowd. "Look, I get that rules exist for a reason, but let's be honest. Does anyone here really feel like my holiday lights are ruining the neighborhood?" A murmur spread through the room. A man near the front, Mr. Hensley, shook his head. "I've lived here for 20 years. This is the first time I've seen the neighborhood come together like this." A young mom raised her voice. "My kids love the lights. It's the best part of their day." Pamela's jaw tightened. "Rules are rules." I held up the copy of city regulations again. "And yet, my display doesn't break a single one. So maybe the problem isn't the lights. It's the way the HOA enforces rules that don't reflect what people actually want." That struck a nerve. People nodded, voices rising in agreement. Pamela's grip on the room was slipping, and she knew it. "I propose a vote," I said, stepping forward. "If enough people agree, we can amend the HOA rules to allow seasonal displays. Let's make this neighborhood a place where people can celebrate without fear of ridiculous fines." A buzz of excitement filled the air. Even some of Pamela's usual supporters looked uncertain. Her face reddened. "You can't just—" "Yes, we can," I interrupted. "The HOA bylaws allow residents to petition for a vote on policy changes, and I've already collected signatures from over half the neighborhood." I dropped the petition on the table in front of her. Pamela stared at it, her mouth tightening into a thin line. The room burst into applause. By the end of the meeting, the vote was official. HOA rules would be updated to allow holiday displays, and Pamela's power was crumbling. But I had one last surprise waiting for her. That night, as our light show glowed brighter than ever, a moving truck pulled up to the empty lot down the street, the lot I had quietly purchased the week before. The new sign out front read, "Community Garden, free for all residents." Pamela might control the HOA for now, but I had something she couldn't stop, the power of a community united against her nonsense. And as I watched her slam her blind shut in frustration, I couldn't help but smile. In the days following the vote, the neighborhood seemed to transform overnight. My light display wasn't just a symbol of rebellion anymore. It became a beacon of community pride. Families strolled the sidewalks at night, marveling at the glowing spectacle. Kids laughed as they pointed out their favorite decorations, and neighbors who had barely spoken before now gathered for impromptu hot cocoa nights beneath the twinkling lights. Pamela, however, was far from pleased. I'd catch glimpses of her pacing in her living room, watching the parade of visitors with a scowl. It was obvious she hated how much joy the lights had brought to the community. Her grip on the HOA had weakened, and for the first time, she was losing control. But I wasn't done yet. I had one more card to play, my newly purchased lot. I didn't just want to win a battle against Pamela, I wanted to change the neighborhood for good. So while the lights continued to draw crowds, I began organizing a community workday. Flyers went out inviting residents to help transform the vacant lot into a shared space everyone could enjoy. To my surprise, dozens of neighbors showed up, shovels and paintbrushes in hand. We spent the weekend building garden beds, painting benches, and hanging string lights around the perimeter. Someone even brought a fire pit for cozy gatherings. By Sunday evening, the once empty lot had become a beautiful community garden. A space open to everyone, no HOA permission required. And the best part? Pamela couldn't do a thing about it. The lot was private property, my property. A week later, I held a ribbon-cutting ceremony. Families gathered as I stood beside the brand-new sign, "Community Garden, Open to All." "Thank you all for coming," I said, my voice carrying over the excited chatter. "This garden belongs to all of us, a place where everyone, regardless of HOA rules, can come together and celebrate what makes this neighborhood special." The applause was thunderous. Even the local news returned to cover the event, and this time they weren't interested in hearing Pamela's complaints. But of course, she tried anyway. "You can't just do whatever you want," she snapped at me after the ceremony, her face flushed with anger. "This isn't how things work." I smiled, refusing to be rattled. "Actually, it is. You see, Pamela, the HOA governs public spaces. But this is mine. And as long as I own it, the community will have a place to gather without your interference." Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. For the first time since moving here, I saw something new in her expression. Defeat. But I didn't stick around to watch her stew. Instead, I joined my neighbors by the fire pit, sharing stories and laughter beneath the glow of our unstoppable holiday lights. And just when I thought things couldn't get any better, I received a letter from the mayor's office a few days later. The city had officially recognized our community garden as a model for future neighborhood spaces. They even planned to provide additional funding to expand it with playground equipment and picnic tables. Pamela's reign was officially over. In the end, it wasn't just about lights or rules. It was about reclaiming the spirit of the neighborhood. By standing up to the HOA's pettiness, I helped foster a community where people felt free to be themselves. And every time I saw those lights twinkle, I knew one thing for sure. No HOA rule could ever dim the power of a united neighborhood. And as for Pamela? Well, she quietly resigned from the HOA board a month later. Victory never shined so bright. Years later, our neighborhood's holiday display had become a cherished local tradition. What started as my defiance against an overbearing HOA turned into something much greater. A symbol of community spirit and standing up for what's right. Every time I flip the switch on my holiday lights, I smile. Not just because I won the battle against the HOA, but because I proved that a little light can push back against even the pettiest rules. And no one, especially not an HOA, can dim my holiday spirit.